Unemployment, bankruptcy, homelessness, a global economic crisis. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about our global economic recovery? Exploring the impact and seeking solutions, United Nations University presents UNU Conversation Series, The Economic Crisis.
Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of the UNU Conversation Series on the financial crisis, organized in connection with the June 2009 UN Conference on the World Financial and Economic Crisis. I am Jean-Marc Coicaud from the United Nations University Office at the UN here in New York. And with us today in the studio, we have Sam Johnston of the United Nations University Institute of Advanced Studies, UNU-IAS, where he serves as, I think, as a senior research fellow. And Sam specializes in environmental policy, environmental issues, and he's here with us today to discuss the effects of the recent financial and economic crisis on the environment. So Sam, as a way to start, we tend to focus on what the financial crisis means for development, for developing countries, for developed countries and so on. And we don't really focus so much on the connection existing between the financial crisis and environment. So first of all, is there a connection? And if so, what is the nature of this connection? Is the impact of the financial crisis going to be, or is positive or negative?
Well, thank you, Jean-Marc. Always a pleasure to be here with you. And there is a very strong connection between the global financial crisis and the environment. The most immediate and direct impact is that as a result of the recession, a drop in GDP, that means in real terms a drop in consumption. And so less consumption means that we're consuming less rainforest, we're consuming less water, we're consuming less oil, which has a positive effect on the environment.
So you would say that the first impact of the financial crisis is a positive one and a series of positive ones. So
for the environment.
Yeah, for the environment, when it comes to environment.
I would.
Mm-hmm. So, but I'm sure that there are also negative impacts. So what are these?
And also has its multiple and complex impacts. And I'm not sure it's right to describe them as positive or negative in simplistic terms like that. Yeah.
So
the drop in consumption also means a drop in waste. And that's also a positive for the environment in terms of the emission of greenhouse gases. As we know, they're linked to climate change, and so if we emit less greenhouse gases, that will help the climate change issue. Emission of less toxic substances will also have a direct impact. But then there are other effects which will be negative. So the reduced revenues for government, for instance, will mean less is spent on research and development on new technologies. And this will also be the case in the private sector.
So in essence, as a way to start our conversation, you are saying, well, there is a connection between the financial crisis and the environment, and environmental policies, environmental situations, and so on. Second of all, you are saying that it's a complex connection. So how complex it is? Why is it complex? Because it's not a black and white picture?
Each consequence has both a positive and a negative impact. So for instance, a drop in the price of oil, by way of example, has a positive impact. It reflects a positive impact in that it reflects a drop in consumption of oil. But it has a negative impact in the sense that the drop in the price of oil will make the price of renewable energy less attractive. And so we'll see a drop in the use of renewable energy and also a drop in investment in renewable energy.
So why don't you give us a list, just for sake of clarity, of the list of the positive effects, if you will, and the list of the negative effects, and then we'll see what could be done about this set of affairs.
Well, it's not possible to give you a comprehensive list, but there are positive effects in terms of the way the amount of water we use, which will have positive effects on the degradation on rainforest, for instance. There'll be positive effects in terms of obviously emitting greenhouse gases or other toxic substances. There'll be positive effects in terms of food security, in the sense that the price of food has dropped significantly, which makes it more affordable for the world's poorest people, and therefore the food riots that we saw in 2008 and 2007 are less likely to occur. But the negative effects there'll be negative effects of all of these things. So, for instance, let me look at the food sector again. Although the price of food will have dropped, it does mean also that agriculture as an export commodity for developing countries will drop as well. And so, although the poorest might benefit initially from the drop in the food price, they'll suffer in the long term because an important export commodity, an important commodity for them will be eroded. Similarly with other impacts, like another big impact will be on tourism, which directly affects the environment in the sense that it both consumes environmental resources but it supports environmental resources. So, for instance, a drop in tourism will mean much less aviation fuel is burnt, and therefore that impact on the atmosphere will be less. But many local communities and indigenous people and many parks in the developing countries exist substantially on the income derived from tourism. So that income will be eroded. And similarly with as I was saying, the investment in renewable energies is under threat with the drop in GDP, in the sense that when oil was $100 a barrel, the price of wind and the price of biofuels and the price of alternative energies, solar, all became much more attractive, and then we saw a much larger uptake of those technologies. But now it's back down to $50 a barrel. The cost of the energy being produced from those areas is much, much less.
So, in essence, you're saying that so there are negative effects, there are positive effects, but in a way you are saying that to each of the upside of the positive effects, you have a downside. That's what you are saying?
Yes.
Okay. So then the following question is, do you think that on the long run, or even on the midterm run and midterm and so on and so on, do you think that the positive effects are going to be more important than the negative ones, or the other way around?
I think a lot will depend on the actions that governments take to deal with the global financial crisis.
So tell us a bit about the different possible scenarios, the best one and the worst one, and the ones in the middle.
The crisis presents an opportunity for us to recast many parts of our society and the rules and the technologies that we use, and we can recast. We can use the crisis to recast things in a positive way, or we can use it to recast in a negative way. And a concrete example of what I mean is that the crisis in America has been used, for instance, to try and introduce a cap and trade scheme, or for greenhouse gas emissions, and in effect to try and reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that the electricity sector is producing in America. It's also been used by Obama recently to increase fuel efficiency requirements in the automobile industry. Now, the latter, for instance, is a result of the administration bailing out the automakers, and 3 or 4 years ago, increasing fuel efficiency was very difficult. And would have been politically unacceptable. Similarly with a cap and trade, I think it's a visionary attempt by the Obama administration to try and bring the US in line with much of the developed world to try and begin to regulate greenhouse gas emission in America, which it will be absolutely vital if our attempts globally to address climate change are good. But in other cases, it's having the policymakers are looking backwards and I guess being negative. So, for instance, exactly the same global financial crisis has been used in Australia to delay the introduction of the emissions trading scheme in Australia.
Yeah, precisely. I'm told that when it comes to policies and what will be the best way to handle the current situation, I'm told that, for instance, the crisis will make it tougher for governments to enact tough legislations to curb emissions for fear of further slowing down their respective economies. I'm also told that the credit crunch means that it will be harder to get capital for environmentally friendly technology. Also, that lower energy prices will make investment in energy efficiency and renewable energy economically unattractive. So what do you think of these three issues?
Well, I mean,
are they well taken, and how do you handle them, and what is your opinion on how it will be handled by governments? Because we talk a lot about green energy and all these things.
Well, it's a great opportunity. I mean, at a superficial level, to some extent, all of those points are true. But I think if we're looking to the crisis as an opportunity and a possibility to re-engineer things in a more sustainable way, then we need to look beyond the simple dollars and cents of a particular investment.
But in order to prepare us better for the future,
exactly.
I mean, you still need to have today, I mean, tomorrow, the resources,
exactly.
And yet these resources now are lacking.
Yeah.
So how do you somehow bridge the two?
Well, you make the case that if you don't invest in these technologies of tomorrow, you'll be worse off, you'll be in a worse position when the upturn comes. And in this case, it's been made, for instance, with the human resources in many companies. It's been shown that those companies which laid off many, many workers in a recession were laggards in terms of picking up when the recession ended and the global economy improved. And those companies that hang on to their prime resource, i.e. their workers, actually were better positioned to take greater opportunity out of the upturn. And the same is the case with technology. If you keep on investing, now is the time actually to invest in R&D very heavily, because it'll be ready and it'll be available to be used in when the economy turns the corner and starts to grow again. And if you've got clean, green technologies which use energy more efficiently, for instance, these are the technologies that China and India are really going to be looking for, rather than old, antiquated technologies.
Yeah, but I mean, we have to invest. We all agree on this, especially when it comes to green energy and so on. But I mean, as we just said, there is a credit crunch. So where do you find the resources? I mean, you said you have to make the case. Okay, that's fine. But how do you make where do you find the resources when there is an unwillingness to really lend money, when there is actually a lack of or scarcity of resources? How do you practically make the case?
Well, I think the dollar figures associated with the stimulus packages demonstrate that there is resources available to deal with these issues. None of them are as the scale of investment that we need to maintain to develop renewable technologies, for instance, is nowhere near the scale of investment that's been used to try and save the investment banks in America, for instance, or to finance the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, for instance. So it's actually not really a question of do we have enough resources, it's a question of how we apply our resources.
Allocation of resources. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned this idea that we have the resources in the various stimulus packages which have been put forward in the past months. Do you have an idea of what has been allocated on paper and in reality to precisely trying to green the economy?
It's relatively small amount of the packages. It is there in the packages. So in the the stimulus package, which was passed recently in Congress, there is multi-billion-dollar investments in various renewable energies and efficiency of energy sources and stuff like that. And it's the same in Europe as well.
It's relatively minor.
It's relatively minor, yeah.
Do you think that it should be more important?
I personally do think it would be more important. I think it would be investment well spent, and the return on that investment would be much greater than some of the other investments in these stimulus packages, for sure. There is also, but there is a bigger picture here too, which is that a lot of the investment in those stimulus packages is being used to develop infrastructure. And here is a great opportunity, perhaps the best in a generation, to really redevelop our infrastructure. And we can do it in a progressive, forward-looking, visionary way, so or we can do it in the way we've done it in the past.
Way. So in fact, all the money which is going to go into rebuilding infrastructures could be also called upon as a way to precisely green the economy.
Yes, very much.
So even though this money is not allocated per se to greening the economy, it could be made as a tool for doing so.
Very much so, and also we need to pay careful attention to the fact that these infrastructure projects will have impacts on the environment, and if we shouldn't relinquish our existing controls about their impacts just for the sake of political expediency. So we shouldn't, for instance, approve major road projects without making sure that they meet the environmental standards that we've set in the past.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation that the crisis has caused lower levels of carbon emissions worldwide. So does this mean that the world could place the environment lower on its list of priorities, and perhaps instead solely focus on getting economies going again?
It could, but I would note that most of the world's major governments have indicated in the lead up, say for instance, to this important climate change conference in Copenhagen at the end of this year.
We'll talk about it in a minute, yes.
Most of them have made public statements repeatedly that they will not allow the global financial crisis and its impact on their economies to derail their commitment to addressing that particular environmental issue. So
in other words, my question would be, do you know of any efforts in the field of greening the economy, renewable energies, and so on and so on, which could, or should wait until the global economy is in better shape? I mean, on the environmental list, I mean, do we have a priority list when it comes to issues which have to be addressed right away in the context of the crisis, or despite the crisis, or others which could wait a bit?
Well,
when you're a policymaker, you have a limited amount of resources, so you have to make choices. You have to locate, what you have based on your priorities.
A clear priority for the next year, for sure, is climate change in the environmental area, and that.
So we shouldn't use the crisis as an occasion for us. Okay, we have this emergency here, so let's push things a bit further down the road when it comes to climate change. You are saying that climate change is so important that let's not use the crisis to really push things further down when it comes to climate change.
Yeah, and climate change is not going to wait for the world economy to pick up. Okay. It's happening now. It's a product of 200 years industrialisation. There might be a small blip in the emission of greenhouse gases, but the trends and the impact that we're seeing to date is not going to be in any way noticeably affected by that downturn. So it's on its own timetable, a biological timetable, if you will. And so we need to keep. And that is, according to the scientists' latest prediction, is much worse than we thought even a year or two ago. So the urgency of acting on climate change has only increased in the last year. So if we were to delay our responses to climate change, it would be a very, very dramatic and significant effect on our future, I would have thought.
You talked earlier about the fact that commodity prices are going down, or have gone down. I mean, how does this phenomenon affect the development of the renewable energy sector?
Well,
or is it an unfair question?
Well, it has direct impacts, it has indirect impacts. As I said before, the cost of energy production, the market's sensitive to the cost of energy production. So if one form of energy production from coal or oil or gas, its cost is reduced, then other forms which costs aren't reduced, which is the case for renewables, will be comparatively worse off, and the consumers will use less of it. But I think what's But it can also be very positive. Retooling, we can redesign systems so we can create tax incentives to invest in research and development and support these renewables. And I think also we're also got to recognise that the process of decarbonising the society is not actually restricted to government policy. It's also in the hands of the private sector there. And there are significant developments, I think, in the pipeline there, which will make a big impact on our ability to tackle climate change. And I'm very excited by some of those developments. And in particular, I think we're on the threshold of a significant change in the way we produce energy, in that we, up until now, we have largely produced energy, our electricity especially, through huge power plants, coal-fired, gas-fired, nuclear-fired, whatever, and it's then been distributed through a network system. And I see that in the next generation for sure, but maybe even in the next 10 years, is that we're going to move to a much more dispersed system of energy generation, where each household becomes an energy producer, and our need for these massive power plants becomes reduced, and the system becomes much more diverse and stable. And I liken that change, I think we're on the threshold of that, of a change which is similar that happened with computers in the 70s, where we had these big IBM mainframe computers which were the mainstay of the IT, and then in the space of 10 years the whole industry was turned upside down by the PC revolution. And nowadays you can see that the internet, one of the most powerful manifestations of IT, is dependent and reliant and functional through the medium of your and my laptop, and not through the IBM. And I think that the energy production sector faces a similar quantum shift about to take place, where the price of solar cells, for instance, will be dramatically reduced, and that almost every new house that's built in a generation's time, imagine that every tin roof will be a solar panel generating electricity and generating power, which feeds into a massive grid, which then the economy uses as the source of its power.
So precisely, so far we have mainly talked about the dangers, the risks associated with the financial crisis for the environment and so on. What are the opportunities? I mean, you talked about it a minute ago, but if you had to really think about ways through which the crisis could be turned into an opportunity to address issues such as carbon emissions and climate change, you talked about it, but also how could the crisis be used to open up opportunities for growth in the area of green technology? I mean, what would be your take on these issues? On this, I mean, what would be your answer to these questions? And also, perhaps, how has the crisis affected the efforts of the private sector? You were just talking about the private sector to really precisely adopt or invest in green technology. So, how do you turn the current situation into one of opportunity? And what has been what have you witnessed in terms of the private sector, trying to catch up with the current situation in connection with the need for green technology and so on? So first of all, opportunities and so on.
Well, there are many opportunities, but I think in terms of the direct impact of climate change, of the global financial crisis on companies, specifically, and the way they've responded to it so far, it's been a largely a survival exercise for many companies, and they've been wondering how they can weather the financial crisis, and so they've been slashing budgets and strategizing about saving costs, and not really responding in anything but a survival strategy to shelving mining projects, to shelving big infrastructure projects like that. And the ones that are, but there are signs, for instance, in China, much of the solar energy, the companies producing voltaic cells are doing still very, very well, making lots of money, and they haven't had anywhere near the same, have to undertake anywhere near the same dramatic action that some of large companies have to do in order to survive. So, but I think I'd like to move on one of the main priorities or impacts, I think, of the global financial crisis, which is an opportunity, is that it's demonstrated to everybody that how connected we are, how globalised we are. Climate change does that too, but the global financial crisis really has shown us how a mortgage in Alabama can affect the farmer in South Africa, and in a really direct way in their back hip pocket. And I think that awareness bolsters the strength and awareness and resolve to tackle issues globally as well. It validates the attempts of the UN and the multilateral system in a way which means something to people. They can see, well, I do need to worry about what happens in another country, in more than just environment, in more than just weather. And it affects my bottom line very dramatically. And I think that new awareness is in a sense a great opportunity to really reinvigorate and give added momentum to the climate change discussions in Copenhagen.
So precisely, you just mentioned the word Copenhagen. So in June we are having this conference, and we are reaching the end of this conversation. So let's be brief and to the point on the matter. In June we are having this UN conference on the financial crisis. In your view, what would be the nature of the conversation and perhaps the nature of the decisions to be taken regarding environmental issues, having in mind that we're going to have, I think it's in December, right, this UN conference in Copenhagen on climate change. So how can we use this upcoming UN conference on the financial crisis to really be better prepared for the UN conference on climate change scheduled to take place in Copenhagen in December?
Well, in June, I think it'll be very important that the conference re-emphasise the importance of the climate change negotiations, and that the current financial crisis is not a reason or an excuse to delay action, and that the commitment to adopt the roadmap for addressing climate change after 2012, when the current roadmap expires, is as urgent and necessary and important now as it was 2-3 years ago when it was set as the date for agreeing the roadmap. I think that's a critical and very important message that needs to be made at the highest levels of all government, at the summit level of the international system, because there are a lot of challenges, a lot of brackets in the negotiating text, a lot of issues which negotiators need to come a long way in order to resolve and meet each other. But where there's political where there's a political force and will to reach agreement, and coming from the highest levels, it's possible to do a deal in Copenhagen.
Thank you.
And it's not only possible but vital.
Yeah. Sam Johnston, thank you. Sam is a senior fellow with UNUIS based in Tokyo. We have now reached the end of this conversation. I thank you for your time. I thank you for watching. I am Jean-Marc Coicaud from the United Nations University Office at the UN here in New York, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.